Thank you very much. I might just start with some personal stories, actually, because it's the 40th anniversary. So, for me, what this brings back is memories of my dad, who died nearly 20 years ago. But 40 years ago, he was a journalist on the Mirror, and he had his own page. Someone had some bright idea to do that, I don't know who. But that meant that when the miners' strike came along, he devoted that year, he was really in his prime, to getting as much of the miners' strike as he could into the Mirror from the viewpoint of the miners. So whenever you went to meet him for lunch, there would be miners from different parts of the country sharing a lunch with you, and that just dominated his life. And during the strike, every now and then, Scargill would ring the house, and when that happened, there was excitement, that things were really looking like they might win, especially around the Nakod Sea, where it was very, very close. I wanted to talk to this book that I wrote with Morag Livingston about policing since 1983. So to understand the policing of the miners' strike, you have to go back not 40 years, but 41 years. And in January 1983, there was a private meeting in the Home Office, and at the meeting was the Home Secretary, Willie Whitelaw, the senior members of the civil service and senior members of the police, ACPO officers, chief officers. And it was a private meeting, and it was a party to celebrate the formation of a manual that introduced into this country paramilitary policing for public disorder. It was completely secret. Nobody else knew about it. Parliament knew nothing about this transformation. The manual was 500 pages long, and the front page of the manual said to be seen by ACPO officers only. So even the rank and file of the police didn't know this had happened. That's how secret it was. It was never fessed up, the role of the Home Secretary in helping the Home Office to form this manual and to introduce into this country paramilitary policing. So when you understand that, then you can understand the policing in the miners' strike, which was brutal. So probably the culmination of that is what you see at Orgreave. And you see for the first time in this country the use of the short shield and the baton, with the squads coming in. Behind the horse charges, which are straight out of the manual, the short shield and the baton is something within the manual, and those squads that come in and smash up the miners there who are defenceless. And you see the phrase within the manual, the right to incapacitate just for being present. Completely unlawful. As I say, Parliament never knew anything about this, but that's what the Tories did before the strike. The other aspect within the chapter on Orgreave, which I want to talk about, is the lies that Thatcher told in order to prosecute that strike. So the big lie she told is that the police are independent. They are separate to the government. They enforce the rule of law. And that was a complete lie, for the reason we already know, that they had given them secretly paramilitary powers, which nobody else knew about, but also in the way that the strike was prosecuted. From the first week, 2 organisations were set up. The National Reporting Centre, which was known about publicly, which was a body that could move vast numbers of police across constabularies, from Merseyside to another constabulary, because constabularies are their own entities. Now that's not unlawful, but the way they did it was they gave them a blank cheque. So back then there was local democracies that controlled that sort of thing. They controlled the budgets, and they basically gave a blank cheque to move vast numbers of coppers around in order to make this strike happen. But more importantly than that, probably, is that the NRC collated intelligence on the miners, and that all went back to the Home Office. That was all done secretly, and that was all funnelled into something called MISC 101, which was an organisation which was a smaller part of the cabinet, completely secret, chaired by Thatcher. and it met every week, sometimes twice a week, to talk about the strike and the policing of the strike. So the idea that the policing was somehow independent is the complete opposite of the truth. And within the MISC 101, in the week, shortly before Orgreave, in May '84, they discussed support for the police efforts to bring more serious charges where appropriate. And what you saw at Orgreave was the riot charges being introduced, the worst charge you can get, facing a life sentence following that MISC 101 meeting. Now, someone sent me this week a reference to Essex within the MISC 101, so I just wanted to pass that on. Leon Britton, at a meeting of the MISC 101 on Monday the 4th of May 1984, gave a report back on arrests made since the beginning of the dispute. The great majority of those arrested had been minors. Some unemployed men and students had also been arrested, but their numbers were insignificant, except in the case of students from Essex University. Not incidentally, so that was mentioned there, but there's another story that someone else sent me, which I thought I should pass on, about the students, and there's a bit of a tangent, but it's another memory of Wivenhoe is at the time when the local students took the miners to the Students' Union bar for a few pints, but also gave some of the older members some marijuana to try. It was a 2-mile walk back to their digs, and many were so affected by the drug that they were falling into the ditches and hedges and needed carrying. They managed to get back to the village, singing Welsh songs all the way, and all the locals were out in the street, dressed in their night clothes, clapping and cheering. So, the other thing I wanted to come to, so you have the party at the beginning to celebrate the use of these, the secret bringing about these powers, and then you have a party at the end. So I just wanted to read this book from the book. This is tough, because this is the end of the strike, but this is what they did, the government, along with the police. The miners walked back to work in March 1984 with trade union banners held high. A few days later, the Home Office held another party to thank the police for all they did during the miners' strike. A drinks event had been planned for the previous summer, but ACPO got cold feet due to fears of over-close identification with the government during the miners' strike. Around 30 guests attended, including those from the police forces most directly involved in the miners' strike. Senior staff of the National Reporting Centre, ACPO, Sir Brian Coogan, he's a top civil servant. As they celebrated the creation of the secret manual in 1983, so they celebrated its successful brutal use 2 years later. Also at the celebration were Chief Constable Peter Wright and Assistant Chief Constable Clement from South Yorkshire Police, who'd overseen the policing at Orgreave, and Mrs. Thatcher. Within a few years of the party, Wright met Thatcher again at the Hillsborough Stadium, the day after a tragedy that would result in the deaths of 97 Liverpool football fans. Thatcher unconditionally supported the police and promoted the lie that the fans were responsible for the disaster. It took 23 years for the Hillsborough families to expose the police cover-up and attain justice. The behaviour of South Yorkshire Police that day cannot be disassociated from their behaviour at Orgreave. Now, I wanted to just follow through Thatcher's story. So this book tells the story of when we've had this manual, protests that turned violent, and how the manual was continued to be used secretly and privately, and its effect on protest in this country. But I just followed through to the poll tax protest a bit further on in 1990, and just explain the manual again. There were horse charges and people sitting outside Downing Street against the poll tax, sitting peacefully. They sent in the horse charges from the use of the manual. That led to a riot, basically. That was the tinderbox. People may have been there, certainly would have seen images. In Trafalgar Square, it's absolutely mobbed. There's 200,000 people attended that day in a space that only really takes 70,000 people. Police vans charging about at great speed, And always, I think, subconsciously, what we thought is, well, they must have just panicked in the chaos. It's a tactic in the manual that you can drive at crowds at speed to control them. Now, why don't we know that today? Because what happened was Thatcher, who had been told there were problems with the policing that day, had a private meeting with the Commissioner Imbert and with the officers in charge, and they arranged for an internal review which took a year to come out and was mildly critical of the police. So all of the tactics and where they derived from were covered up and have never been fessed up. And they got away with that in that way. Other people, Corbyn, Tony Benn, were calling for a public inquiry. If they'd won that argument, we would have known all about the manual. It would have fed back into how the miners had been policed just earlier on that decade, the previous decade. And it would have exposed all of this. Now, I don't know how much I've got, not too long probably. Okay. I just want to talk about today what's happening with the Orgreave inquiry demand. 2016, Amber Rudd said, we don't need an inquiry because policing has improved. I'm not sure anybody alive today with a pulse could maintain that position, given everything we've seen on Cousins, not just on policing generally, but particularly on protests. There's constant unlawful activity. All the rest of the XR protesters in Trafalgar Square were proved to be unlawful. Constant cases coming through the court. But the idea that policing improved is no longer tenable. And the reason they don't want the inquiry came out, and she went to a dinner party with a friend who wrote it in a book, that she didn't want to embarrass Thatcher's legacy. Today we have Sunak and someone else called Robin Simcox has come out this week attacking extremism and protests generally. All of this is allowed to develop and unchallenged by our media because our history has not been resolved, because they've not been held to account for what they've done in the past. And that's why the inquiry is so important. For Sunak to talk about we live in a democracy and people shouldn't be allowed to go and protest generally is completely contradicted by the history. The democracy he talks about, the history of protest shows that there have been secrecy, secret decisions and undemocratic interventions in protests which have undermined our dissent. And that is what we set out. What we show here is that there's involvement of the state, there's the involvement of the media, big business, civil service, judiciary, and privately the government, all undermining dissent and protest in these protests that have happened. And that's why it's so essential that we have an inquiry. And so I think the 15th of June this year, being the 40th anniversary, is crucial, not just to respect what happened to people at Orgreave. And there's, we've seen some of the documentaries, some better than others. I think there's one coming through which is going to be much better. But I think we can win that demand. And the Labour Party, it's rather extraordinary, have made a commitment. They refused to make commitments, but they have committed themselves to an investigation into Orgreave. I don't believe that will happen unless these protests are big and vibrant, and that they are made to do that when they inevitably come in. I think the Tories are on 18% in the latest poll. So that's why it's so crucial that we come together and make the 15th of June and the events around it as big as possible. And so the other aspect of that, I want to say, is that the general thrust and attack on the right to protest also makes it so important. So anybody who's concerned about that needs to come out and protect our right to protest. And this is a central place where we should bring all the banners, all the trade union campaign banners to the 15th of June to make that statement as well. Thank you very much.